Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Breaking Point Podcast UK. Today we're here with Hannah. Hannah, what's your surname? Because
Murray, A-Y.
Hannah Murray, and Hannah is you're doing loads and loads of different things. You're a podcast host, and are you a mental health nurse? Is that
I am.
by profession? Yeah. So we met, we didn't actually meet.
I'm a mental health professional. Yeah.
Professional, nice.
I'm a mental health professional in the NHS, but I run a private CIC as a counsellor and therapist.
What's the CIC?
A community interest company, so kind of like a charity, but any money that's generated in terms of a kind of a financial income gets put back into the foundation and used wider to provide free access to mental health support.
Very cool, very cool. Tell people what it is that you're up to.
So Beautiful Minds, like I've said, is a community interest company, and that means that my mission is to provide wider access to mental health support in our county of Hampshire. I'm based in Portsmouth. And alongside that, it's kind of split into 4 entities. So I provide private one-to-one therapy and coaching to adults and young people from age 9 plus. So that's the coaching kind of therapy element to the company. Then I have a community section, which is providing free community workshops for mental health across the city of Portsmouth. I'm just about later this year to branch out into other cities as well in our patch. And alongside that is also the wellbeing strategy support in terms of organisations and corporate companies who are wanting to kind of get in the professionals, sort out their mental health culture, and try and provide their employees with a better work-life balance. With that is the Beautiful Minds and Young People, so one-to-one therapy, like I've said, but also I'll go into schools to support the schools with any kind of education around mental health, supporting them with kind of classroom behaviours and looking at strategies of different ways of working. And with young people, we have things like ADHD to look at and autism and those different type of entities. That means some children struggle with the environment of a school. And it's about looking at the strategies around how the school can better support those young people to really gain the best from their education. And lastly is the podcast, like I've said. We are in season 5 going into season 6. And last year we won Mental Health Podcast of the Year award nationally. It's called the Beautiful Minds Podcast. And that for me was stemmed from years of writing blogs. So my mental health, I needed a release, so I used to write things down. I put them out in the ether. I don't think I ever thought anyone would read them, but some people did. And that's where the podcast was blossomed from. I was contacted by a reader whose husband owned a music recording studio. And at that time, podcasts were becoming quite trendy. So he wanted to branch out and see whether the studio could offer a different facility to people. And that's where it began. And 4 years later, we're now winning awards and we're going into our 6th season.
When you say you were suffering mental health and you were writing blogs, what sort of things depending on what you're comfortable talking about, what were you struggling with and why do you think they arose in your life?
So I'm a very open book, so I'm happy to share my story. And part of what I do as the Beautiful Mind Coach is purely based on sharing that story. So I had a very privileged upbringing, went to a really good school. And in my very early teens, probably around 13, 14, I really struggled with the sense of belonging and the sense of fitting in or finding where I fit in the peer arena at school. And I got bullied severely at school for being the different one. Back then, it wasn't very cool to be ginger, and now it's very cool to be ginger. But it was a really difficult time for me. And there were lots of other elements to the story in terms of why. Bullying was very rife. I very much became a hermit and didn't want to disappoint my parents. My parents were very successful in their careers and weren't at home very much, and they won't mind me saying this because we've had many a conversation since. But our childhood was very much focused around their career success. So I struggled with a lot of it on my own. And my mental health got so dark into my late teens and early 20s, having not dealt with any of those things, very much shut them away and just hid them from everyone in silence, that I attempted to take my own life at 21. And my darkest bout of depression at that time really made me believe that I didn't deserve to be here and that I wasn't deserving of anything from education to relationships to a successful career. So it led me down a very dark path that also meant that those triggers of not wanting to be a disappointment or talk to anyone, when you're feeling that dark and depressed, you definitely don't want to be a burden on those individuals. So I kept it to myself. I wrote a few letters of gratitude and thanks, and one day just made the decision that was it. And I'm very fortunate that one of my best friends at the time got wind of how I was feeling and noticed a change in me and raised the alarm, and I am still here. But if it wasn't for being one of those individuals who had to access some support at that time, that was a point of crisis that it was invaluable to me. And it is the reason why my career has gone where it's gone, is because I now am on a mission to not allow anyone else to feel or be as isolated as I was with my own mental health.
Yeah, that's brilliant. What an incredible story. It's so interesting, like anxiety and low mood, that you get caught in a feedback loop of you feel isolated for whatever reason. For you it was because you were being bullied and maybe you thought that your parents weren't as present as they could have been at the time, and then that makes you feel anxious and depressed, and the more anxious and depressed you get, the more you isolate yourself, and then you get into this spiral, and it just sort of keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and it's a really difficult place to be, obviously, and managing that and trying to sort of unpick, and maybe claw's the wrong word, but erect yourself out of that state can be really difficult.
It's really hard to navigate, and I think it's really easy for people to say, oh, well, you could just talk to someone, or you could just help yourself a little bit, or you could just go to the doctor. But actually, unless you've experienced what it's like to be in the thick of deep, dark depression, then there is no comprehension of how difficult it is to say, I have a problem.
Have you ever found that when you're anxious about something really badly, it sort of pulls all sorts of other little anxieties in, and you create like this giant monster of an anxiety? And I think that's like the dragon. Once you conquer a little dragon, so to speak, it makes you stronger so that you can then take on a larger dragon. So I just think that's such a helpful quote to tell people, and it's something that I wish people told me whilst I was growing up. Obviously not quite in such a convoluted manner.
Definitely.
A bit more simplified.
And I think sometimes it's about understanding, so that one of the things I specialise in as a therapist is anxiety and depression. But from a kind of deep dive point of view of, do you understand your anxiety cycle? Because everyone has a cycle. And what we mean by that is there are 4 elements that trigger anxiety. And actually, if you can learn to understand and manage your anxiety better, you can take back control. And unfortunately, in society, everyone who feels that they're labelled or has been labelled as an anxiety sufferer thinks there's a way to go and get fixed. But you can't be fixed. Once you're a sufferer of anxiety, that's it. It's about how you manage that and manage the impact in your daily life. And when you look at the cycle of anxiety, the four elements are your thoughts, your feelings, your physical sensation, or how it affects your physical body, and your then behavior. And those four elements, if you are feeding them, you're actually reaffirming your anxiety to still be here. And what you have to do as part of kind of the self-development process is work through each one of those stages and understand your why.
Do they come in a particular order, or can they?
So they generally tend to come. Your thoughts create your feelings create the physical sensation, and then your physical sensation manages how you then respond or behave in terms of action, and then by how you act reaffirms the thoughts from point one. So it becomes a catch-22 cycle.
Just going back to something that you said earlier, just because it's a strange question, but I wonder maybe we could just sort of explore the idea. You said, and I'm sure a lot of people say, they didn't feel like they deserved. Where do you think that sort of thought pattern comes from, that notion of I deserve or I don't deserve this? What does that actually mean?
I think it's a good one to explore. I think the majority of us are so consumed by expectation from others and that worry and fear of judgment about someone not understanding why you would want to pursue something different to someone else, or if it is so far-fetched out the box, why you would want to be kind of so what people class as extra or different in terms of a career path or a creative path. And I think when I reflect on that for myself, feeling like I didn't deserve to be here definitely came down to the behaviours of others, because they made me feel like I was useless and worthless and that I didn't deserve to be here. Alongside that was my own feelings about kind of struggling with my identity and my sexuality and not really having that group of friends where I was accepted to be who I was. In my teens, I was definitely what some people describe as a thespian. I was much more creative person than an academic. I was very much an art person. I went to art school eventually, and nobody really got me because I was so kind of not the norm. And that's where the bullying started, and those people then make you feel like you don't belong and that you don't fit the norm, or they label you. And I think that was then reaffirmed into my late teens when I did go to art college. And although I was struggling with my mental health, I'm very lucky that I passed all of my studies. That it was that little avenue for me where I was in an arena where I felt like I could be a little bit more myself and I wasn't judged, because there was probably people that were weirder and wonderful than me in that arena.
Absolutely, yeah.
But still, those elements at home, or those elements of kind of lack of friendship and family dynamics, was still that moment of struggle, I think. So because all the pieces in the puzzle didn't fit, it was still a challenge.
Yeah, no, I get you. And just sort of starting from the beginning of that answer, that it's amazing, because I've worked in schools since I was sort of 18, on and off, mainly on special needs school, and then recently a primary school. And the capacity, sort of the ability that young children have to fire off scattergun comments to multiple children, and then to hone in on the ones that they can will get feedback from. And that's what's so awful about bullying. It's that the people get bullied are the children that get bullied, and the people in general, to be fair, because there's a lot of bullying in workplaces, etc., are exactly the sort of people who don't deserve to be bullied and are most susceptible to being bullied. You know, obviously, I suppose, but also that's incredibly unfortunate. And, you know, kids, even as young as, I don't know how old, you know, they know, maybe they don't know what to look out for, but they know what responses to hone in on, and then they, you know, it just sort of goes from there, and it sort of spirals. And my mum was bullied a lot at school, and it was because she didn't have a good home life. So there was that, they could sort of feel the bullies could sense that vulnerability in her. Yeah, yeah. That's maybe weakness, but certainly the vulnerability, and that's what's so awful about it. So, thankfully I was never bullied at school, even though I am ginger.
I am thankful that I am not in the generation that are now, because if I was bullied in this day and age, I honestly don't. I say this very flippantly, but I honestly don't think I would be here.
Because of social media?
Because they are so influenced. They are so influenced by so much, and the dynamics of being a young person now than 20, 30 years ago is so, so different.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. The capacity to sort of leave people out is so much easier now through social media, and the way that, if there's a party going on, etc., and you're not invited, that's a very isolating and damning.
It's in your face.
Yeah, exactly. You're very well. You're completely aware of it. Both your parents were working, and your childhood was around their careers. Do you think the fact that there wasn't one parent, or they didn't have more time for you, do you think that meant that you felt slightly less cared for, and that meant that that's what maybe led to the vulnerability that was seen at school? Or do you think it was just in you there and it had nothing to do with what your parents were doing?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I've never been asked something like that on my story.
Good. We like that.
Look, it was a very different time in the world back then. We're talking kind of early 90s. Both my parents were very successful, but my dad's career always came first. So when I talk about my mum being successful, she was around a lot more than my dad was. And we had my life was very privileged. I didn't have a bad upbringing at all, and part of my story isn't affirming that. There were just things that were different for us, and it meant that we spent more time with grandparents, for example, than parents. And although sibling-wise we had each other, we were all very different. So whereas some people would have that relationship with their sibling to have someone to talk to and that sounding board, we basically, what my parents would say, would butt heads. So there was no point putting us in the same room together because we would just fight. So when I talk about the difference in dynamics in the household having an impact on how I felt about myself, it wasn't an individual in particular, and it wasn't because someone wasn't around. Just the dynamics of our family life were very different to, say, the friends and the peers that I had spent time with or been to their homes and seen how the dynamics were. I think that built an expectation of how I thought that my childhood should be, especially reflecting now into my adult years. I always wish that even now I was one of those friends who was lucky enough to have their parents around the corner to go and have a cup of tea with when you'd moved out in your 20s. That wasn't the life for me. I went to university and then I was very independent from that moment, and my parents went and lived abroad. So from a very early phase in my life, in my early 20s, my parents were then very much more not around because they went and lived their life. I know, having had conversations with my parents about that element of my life, that there are things that they definitely recognise that they could have done better. And I know my dad was in the police, and I know that my dad very much recognises that he wasn't around, but he makes up for that now. I'm very lucky and I'm very grateful that I'm still around now to have that time, because it could have been a different story. I think your point about kind of feminism and who should be the breadwinner and those types of societal comments, I don't think that there is a right or wrong way of doing things. I think that just because you have children doesn't mean that you can't succeed or have a successful career. It's about how you manage that in your household and how you make time, whatever that looks like for you, for your children or for whoever that you're caring for or looking after, everyone's entitled to have purpose and fulfillment in their life. And it's about how you see that.
Yeah, it's about managing, isn't it? Yeah, it's about working things out, what's most surmountable for the family. When you say we, how many brothers and sisters do you have? Is that what you were implying?
I had a younger sister.
Okay, so you're the oldest one as well, so that makes sense.
I am the eldest, yeah.
Completely. Yeah, I'm the oldest as well, and I feel like, in my experience, the eldest tends to take the brunt of the new parented of the fact that your parents are, you're their firstborn, so you're the trial run, so to speak, to some degree. Maybe not necessarily, but
and no matter how much your parents say, oh, there is no expectation, or even now, like in my 30s, they're like, there's no expectation. We don't have an expectation. We just want you to live a happy life. You, as the eldest, take that on board because you're the eldest. So you naturally have someone who's looking up to you and who looks to you for kind of, I guess, maybe not taught in a conversational type way, but in terms of your behaviours and what you're doing with your life and the people that you hang around with and all those sorts of arenas, they naturally are going to see that as the younger child because they're the younger child.
Yeah, exactly. And I often say whenever I talk about this that my brother's 4 years younger than me. So I say growing up, he had 3 parents and I had 2 in a weird way because, 4 years is quite a big age gap. So,
that makes sense.
The ability to look at someone who is, because a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old is like, a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old. It's, the ratio stays the same, but obviously the gap is smaller. So that's always, they have that benefit of knowing what to do and what not to do if they watch carefully enough. Right, let's talk about the podcast and let's talk about how that's been and some of the people that you've spoken to and some of the insights that you've learned and et cetera, et cetera.
So like I say, we're on season 6 and this season 5, and this season is all about Let's Talk Men's Mental Health. So who have we had? We've had Dapper Laughs, so Daniel O'Reilly, who's a well-known comedian. We have had Tyler De Cruz from ITV's Kavos Weekender. He's also an ex-Reading footballer. We've had some entrepreneurs, so a guy called Alfie Ruffle who owns Rio Vitalize, who goes and does a lot of promotion in terms of health and well-being in Dubai. We've had an array of men, radio presenters, like there's a lot that's going to come out. The next episode is with Dan Constable, and that goes out on Saturday, the 17th of February, and then it's every other Saturday from that point. Previous seasons have been predominantly female, I have to say, and I've absolutely loved this season in talking to men, but that doesn't make any of the content any of less value. It's just very different, and I think what we're seeing now in terms of the podcast is a lot more men are coming forward and actually resonating with the stuff that they're hearing, not just through our podcast, obviously, but through all of the wealth of podcasts that are out there, is that it's planting those seeds of confidence and relatability with people who are willing to talk about their story too, so that they can help others just like they've been helped by what they've listened to. In terms of learning, I just love learning about people. I haven't worked in kind of the psychology arena for this long and not found it interesting. And everyone's story is so different. We've even up in 5 seasons, we've never had somebody who's shared exactly the same. And we're talking like over 60, 70 episodes. So that's 60 to 70 different people who've shared their story, and it's not been the same as someone else's.
That's what you want, isn't it? That's the goal.
It's just it always was from a place of creating a safe space for people to be happy to talk. And like I said, it stemmed from written blogs where I did exactly that for myself. And now people have this expectation of coming to the studio. And we recently moved to a new studio in an art gallery, which is an even crazier place to host a podcast, but I love it. And people come and they're so apprehensive about, oh my God, I don't know what you want me to say. I don't know what you want me to do. And then within like 2-3 minutes that the intro runs and me and my co-host Tate start talking, they're on it, and it's hard to shut them up sometimes. You kind of try not to make your episodes longer than an hour. And these people, once you start talking and opening the door, they're happy. They're really confident about sharing some raw realities, really.
Yes. And the great thing, I always wish that more people were receptive to coming on my podcast, I suppose, because I feel like there's a notion that, oh, the podcast host is the only person that benefits from going on a podcast, but I don't think that's true at all. I think there's so much benefit in talking about yourself and talking about your story and being able to vocalize and then reformulate afterwards or during, I suppose. And it's not just it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that I win and they lose out on an hour, so to speak. It's that actually talking about things and talking about yourself is mutually beneficial. So I think that's great that they keep going. It means that you're obviously doing a very good job as well. So that's what you want.
And I think when you have open and honest conversations, especially about topics around mental health and well-being, you're actually reaffirming how far you've come and the work that you've done on yourselves and how you feel about yourself by sharing that to some people who don't know you.
Yeah, brilliant. And just sort of, this is a bit so slightly morbid, but going back to the men's mental health thing, I was thinking about this the other day, and it sort of, I thought, oh my goodness, why has no one sort of thought? I mean, I'm sure someone has, but it's not spoken about. So the suicide rates now are something like ridiculous, like 75%, maybe even up to 80% men. And yet, from a personality trait, women tend to be far higher in negative emotion than men are. So from the big 5 personality trait, one of the traits is called neuroticism, which is basically your sensitivity to anxiety and depression. And when you spoke earlier, when you were sort of 13, 14, things started getting more difficult. One of the things that happened to girls when they hit puberty, that their neuroticism goes up, and boys, it doesn't as such. It's not completely sort of gender specific. There's no such thing as gender, but it's not sex related or whatever. But that's such an awful thing that, like, women, I mean, the fact that women have higher levels of negative emotion is obviously awful, which is why there are more women on antidepressant medications, etc., than there are men. But the fact that 75% of suicides are men makes you think, well, there's really a problem there then, isn't it? It's really exaggerated. So I think it makes sense how you've got so many people inundated with opportunities or people wanting to speak to you. So that's, it's really good.
It was important for me. And I think that purely that want to create something like that for this season was purely based on the increase that I'd had as a private therapist in men inquiring about support in the last year, and the amount of males that were turning up to the free workshops that I provide in Portsmouth, alongside the work that I do with and have done with Mindset Maintenance. There was a massive influx at the back end of 2022 and the whole of 2023 that just showed me that there wasn't enough out there. And I mean, you've had the privilege of kind of talking to some other guys who are involved in Mindset Maintenance, and particularly George Carnell, who set up a podcast, Problem Halved, that was predominantly for men to go and share. But he also is the co-founder of United Minds, and in Portsmouth and Hampshire, they have literally saved so many males from deep, dark depression and suicide attempts, because they set up a foundation where men could go physically take themselves somewhere and talk to other men face to face, and that also incorporated the playing of sport. But in suicide rates after COVID in particular went massively sky high for both males and females. In Hampshire alone, the stats are ridiculous, and nationally they're ridiculous. But males, like you say, male suicide rates, I think it's 16% of per 100,000 nationally, which is just crazy statistics. But that's what happens when you live in a mental health crisis, where the services that you can access for support, they can't meet the demand. NHS is going through a completely whole program restructure, which means services are being closed, and that's national. And there isn't the workforce out there because people either retired or changed career paths after COVID. I worked through COVID, I hit burnout, but I'm still going. I have a lot of colleagues who are no longer working because it was either a massive, massive trigger for them, or they were about to hit retirement and thought that that was how we were going to work forever for the rest of our days. But also Brexit also didn't help that, because a lot of our workforce are from countries in Europe or countries far and wide. They are an incredible resource to the NHS, and Brexit made them have to make a difficult decision, and that was to go back to their home countries.
Yeah, absolutely. But I suppose from a more macro level, it's also what happens when you rear a generation of young men with the societal narratives of male privilege and toxic masculinity, and you tell young men and men in general that everything they ever do is as a result of corruption, and they are incredibly privileged, and that because fundamentally at the end of the day, men are expendable and women are invaluable. Every other demographic of society, if they're struggling, the answer is, what can society do to help them? But with men, it's what can men do to help themselves, which I think is absolutely spot on.
Definitely.
If it's so, but I think the key is these. I think the biggest, everything you spoke about is completely true, but I do think the largest aspects are these propaganda narratives that are seeped into the common culture about men and about how awful they can be, the minority, and how privileged they can be, the minority. But most men don't live privileged lives if you actually look at it. So I think, and that's what these men are really struggling with, because
I think, look, toxic masculinity, yeah. I mean, it just teaches men, this is my view, obviously, it teaches men, I guess, to not be feminine in some respects. I mean, who decided that household had pink and blue jobs? I mean, I'm not even sure where that stereotype came from. And I guess from a sexuality, homosexual point of view, it teaches men that gay men can't be traditionally masculine, but they can. And I struggle with some of the narratives behind toxic masculinity. But if we look from a kind of cultural perspective, there are cultures around the world that actually standardize this as how men should be. And I think kind of those cultural differences reaffirm to other cultures that the male should be the man of the house, and they should have more dominance and more strength over women, and that they shouldn't have to do chores around the house because that's a woman's work. And all these stereotypes that society has built, there are unfortunately some arenas in our world where they date stamp that toxic masculinity is okay.
Yes. My response to that would be, I don't think they're as socially constructed as people say they are. You said earlier that your dad's career was more important than your mum's. Not more important, but it was more priority. That wasn't a coincidence. Your mum chose someone who was more successful or going to be more successful than she was. Women want to look up at someone, and that they, in the same sense of in heterosexual couples, you very, very rarely see a woman, the female who's taller than the male. That's not socially constructed, and that sort of phenomenon is extrapolated across all aspects of sort of human behavior and human, I don't know what the right word is, spectrum, I suppose, in sense of money, intelligence. But you are right. I've had some women on my, this is not relevant, and you can say, Ollie, shut up, I don't care. But I had a dating expert on my podcast who said 80% of my clients are high achieving women who can't find someone that they want to date. And I'm thinking, yeah, literally, because they're high achieving, so they want someone who's even more high achieving than they are, and those men just don't exist, or they're few and far between.
Exist. No,
literally, or the ones that do exist, they're sleeping around because they can. So why are they going to settle for you? And that is societal. The notion of social construction is completely true to some degree, but it's not as true as people are led to believe in the modern era. But that doesn't mean to say that...
No, and then when you look at that in collaboration with mental health, you wonder why people feel the way that they do.
Literally, yeah. Completely. Wait, expand on that more, because that I kind of get what you're saying, but I think that's a good point. What do you mean by that?
I mean, so you talk about the dating world, for example. I haven't been in the dating world for a long time, but these women who are aspiring to meet somebody who's like even higher achieving than they are, but they're kind of meeting the top of the high achiever threshold. Like, do these
literally
exist? Then you start to factor in the mindset of, am I ever going to fulfill that element of my life, i.e. being a loving relationship or a long-term successful relationship with somebody who can come in and excel my world? Am I just going to be that lonely person with 25 cats? Like, if you start to find something that's unrealistic, then the only impact that you're going to have is on yourself, because you're forever trying to achieve something you're not going to achieve. Now, in the mental health world, there are close links to kind of poor self-fulfillment and I guess career satisfaction, maybe we can use that term in the dating world, to actually add and impact somebody's level of depression and anxiety, because you start to build up this expectation of yourself. And that's where we end up in people who have lack of self-love and lack of self-worth and limiting beliefs and all of those things. But actually, some of us set that expectation for ourselves by trying to achieve something or meet a requirement that's just unrealistic.
Any person that doesn't want a society that gives equal opportunity for the betterment of a society isn't looking at things correctly, because obviously that's what we should have. We should create a society where, regardless of whatever demographic, if you're competent and you have something to give to provide society, you should be able to give that. Do you have like a methodology when someone comes to you to talk about their issues, or do you have a format that you've learnt or that you've acquired? Was that a weird question?
So no, that's good. There's lots of different practices in terms of therapy and counselling and coaching, and every one of those arenas works in a different way. But the Beautiful Minds Foundation is about building connection, and it's really important that if you're going to get some professional support from someone, that you've built that connection and understanding with each other. So for me, the foundation of kind of starting sessions with me is we always have about an hour and a half as a first contact appointment, and that's for anyone who's coming for anything under Beautiful Minds. And that is a chance for those individuals who are going to become clients to kind of share their woes, because what you don't want to do, especially in therapy, is for every session to be about reliving the experiences that have made you feel the way that you do now. So it's important that that structure start is there so that we can I can gain the information that I need, but also the client releases what they don't want to carry forward. And for some people, they've not said things out loud for years, and therefore they need that opportunity to vent, so that when we officially start sessions, we're actually gaining something really positive and a purpose from having deep conversations and working through toolkits of how to improve that element of their life. There will always be those times where we have to revert back to kind of clarity around a certain situation, but we're not going to live through all of the emotional trauma in conversation. So I always like to build connection. I even do it with corporate clients. We always spend time together to kind of make a plan and set some goals so that not only are the clients achieving, but I'm actually achieving by meeting the requirement. It's just really important as a therapist or a coach to build connections. Now, I am of the opinion that not every client will be for me, and I won't be for every client. And it's really important that you have those honest conversations. And I have said to clients who have approached me and said, I just don't think I'm the right fit for you, but I've been able to signpost them to a couple of other options. And that's the same. I don't take it personally when a client comes to me and we have a first contact appointment and they say, actually, I'm not quite sure that this is what I want, or that I'm not quite sure I'm ready right now. And that's okay for me. I'm fine with that. It's just really important that if you're going, or if you're on your journey of seeking support, that it's with the right person and that you get out the most of it from that time. For anyone listening who's wanting or has been waiting goodness knows how long on a referral list, if you are able to invest in yourself by going out and researching other potential resources, then there is a wealth of stuff out there for you to support yourself first whilst you're waiting. But I've had clients who've also come to me because the service that they've received in the NHS hasn't helped them. It's actually made them worse, because the pathway for mental health, unfortunately, from a kind of talking therapies, counselling point of view, it's a one size fits all. And anyone who goes to them with a specific issue or has had a specific experience, everyone gets put in the same pot. There is only one type of support available, and it either works for you or it doesn't.
Yeah, I've had a lot of therapy in my life, and A, it's a bit of hit or miss with the quality of the therapist, and B, if someone's been like, if you've got deeply embedded things going on and you've got to impact subconscious, which is a bit of a buzz term, but you know what I mean, whatever, you've got to go deeper than just a conscious conversational level. It really helps some form. So I'm trained in something, I'm trained, whatever, it's a bit, I use the term loosely, but I've done something called a course in EFT. I don't know if you know what EFT is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I always think that the sort of combination of some form of somatic therapy alongside talking or something is incredibly important. If you find that just the talking isn't doing it, then it really helps to to go down maybe slightly more Eastern sort of methodology, more bodily release of energy, so to speak. So I find that's really, really helpful.
And I think EFT in particular focuses on the healing element behind emotional belief.
Yeah.
And
absolutely. Which is
it's strongly linked to identity, effectively.
What do you mean? Oh, yes, no, absolutely, yeah, because it's you have a statement, don't you, at the beginning, I am, an I am statement, and your ultimately your identity is a lot, because not only is identity very much rife in sort of the culture nowadays, but also people that talk about procrastination and stuff, they'll say you have to change your identity. If you want to change who you are, you have to start with your identity. You don't say I do, you have to say I am. Or it's these like sort of beliefs that we attach ourselves to, which are really either helpful or detrimental. Okay, so final question. I suppose it's kind of two questions, but what tips would you give to people that are struggling with the mental health, and how do you regulate yourself? Because that's obviously very important and vital to functioning, especially given what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, my well-being is just as important as trying to support other people's. And over the years, I've tried a wealth of weird and wonderful things. For me, my mental well-being is supported by kind of a regular sleep routine. Sleep is massively important for me, and making sure that I'm out in nature or doing some form of exercise. So I'm a massive walker. I live by the sea, so I'm on the seafront all the time. I have the luxury of having the sea in my back garden. But I also am a big swimmer, so I'm normally for the last few weeks I've been in the swimming pool at about 6:15 in the morning, and that sets me up for the day. That keeps me going. I do a lot of self-development work behind the scenes, but a lot of what I do in terms of supporting myself is actually brought off the back of having sessions with clients, because everything that I'm supporting with and everything that I'm teaching reaffirms everything that I once learned myself. For people, it's a very much building what works for you. We talk about mental health as kind of the toolkit. Like everyone needs a toolkit, but no one's toolkit is going to be the same. So things that I do for myself wouldn't necessarily work for you, Ollie, but there probably is things in your life that work for you and support you that I wouldn't necessarily enjoy or work for me either. And what we have to realise is that that's okay. But you have to go out there and you have to work and practice and find what works for you. It's an element of self-harm if you avoid your emotions and you avoid the fact that you need some mental health support, because it can lead you into the spiral of negative outcomes for your own life. And I'm a massive believer in the quote by Henry Ford that says, if you always do what you've always done, you will always get what you've always got. And what we mean by that is, if you don't make a change, nothing can change. So people sit and say, oh, I don't want to suffer with anxiety and I don't want to have bad mental health. And there's a bit of a kind of victim mentality for say. But actually, if you're not willing to kind of pull your big girl pants up and go out and work out for you and get some help around why you're feeling a certain way or what you can do to improve how you're feeling and your emotions for yourself, then nothing will change.
There was a famous psychologist. Yeah, there was a famous psychologist who said one of the preconditions to therapy is a willingness from the patient to want to change, and that's I suppose that's akin to the Alcoholics 12 steps, which is, I think the first step is something like acceptance, or maybe it's not the first step, but it's one of the steps. You have to accept and be susceptible to what someone's trying to tell you. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. And acceptance of what has been and how life currently is one of the biggest steps in self-development, because if you can find acceptance in your past, like I have, that was a moment in my life and I see it as learning, but what that did was encourage me to be able to make my life successful, or as my mum once said, make your chapters worth writing.